All right, let's dive in. Today, we're taking a closer look at hop-on, hop-off buses. You know, those big double-deckers promising the whole shebang of a city's sights.
Ah, the classic tourist staple.
Exactly. We're basing this deep dive on a blog post from a seasoned traveler, Roberta Hill.
Oh, I've heard of her. Isn't she the one with the fantastic Traveling in My 70s blog?
That's the one. She's been everywhere. You know, her blog even has a whole world trip section with stories from Machu Picchu, Galapagos Islands, you name it.
Wow, she sounds like she's really lived a full life of travel.
Oh, absolutely. And what's interesting is how her views on these hop-on, hop-off buses have changed over time.
That is intriguing. Makes you think about how much travel itself has evolved.
Right. So a couple of years ago, she wrote a post generally pretty pro hop-on, hop-off buses.
Okay, so she was a fan.
Yeah, but it's important to remember her experiences back then were based on trips from like 15 years ago.
Oh, wow, that's a long time in the travel world. Think about how much has changed ride-sharing apps, the focus on sustainable tourism.
Totally. And Roberta acknowledges all that in her latest post. One big thing she points out is how much more congested cities have become.
Ah, so the whole hop-off part might not be so easy anymore.
Exactly. Stuck in traffic, takes forever to actually get off, see the sights, and get back on.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if it's really the most efficient way to explore a city. What's her take on public transport?
Well, she suggests that sometimes using the city's public transportation might actually be a better option.
Interesting. More expensive routes, maybe? Reaching areas those tour buses don't?
That's one of her points. She also noticed that some routes skip over really interesting historic areas.
You're kidding, like what?
Well, she mentions some routes in San Francisco miss Chinatown entirely.
Oh, come on. You'd think Chinatown would be a must-have on those tourist circuits.
Right. And it's not just San Francisco. She talks about missing the French Quarter in New Orleans, too.
It does make you think about what you might be missing when you're on these pre-planned routes. Have you ever felt that way on a trip?
Oh, absolutely. Sometimes you just feel like you're being herded from one spot to the next, missing the real vibe of the place.
Right, I totally get that. So any other observations from Roberta about where these buses might not be ideal?
Yeah, she mentioned smaller towns. She thinks walking or using a ride-sharing service like Uber often makes more sense.
Makes sense, especially if you want to explore at your own pace.
Now, before we write off hop-on, hop-off buses completely, Roberta does see some positives.
Oh, so it's not all doom and gloom.
Not at all. She says they can be good for solo travelers or couples who are short on time and want a quick overview.
Okay, so like a quick introduction to the city's highlights.
Yeah, exactly.
And what about families? Any thoughts on that?
She mentions that they can be good for families with young children who might not be up for a lot of walking, although she does say that childcare age breaks can be tricky sometimes.
Ah, gotta love those little details that can make a big difference.
So it seems like Roberta is suggesting we need to be a bit more discerning about when and where we use these buses.
Yeah, it's not a simple yes or no answer, is it?
Not really. It's about considering our individual needs, travel styles, and the specifics of the destination.
I like that. It's about making informed choices as travelers, really thinking about what we want to get out of the experience.
And speaking of informed choices, Roberta's latest post emphasizes planning your route in advance and looking at alternatives like walking, Uber, or even public transportation.
So being a bit more strategic and maybe a bit more sustainable in our choices.
Exactly. It ties into this whole idea of traveling more mindfully, considering our impact on the places we visit.
I think that's a fantastic point. And honestly, sometimes those alternative modes of transportation can lead to the most unexpected and rewarding experiences.
Oh, I completely agree. I have a story about that from a trip I took to, I remember this one time I was in Amsterdam and decided to try the tram system.
Oh, how was it?
It was amazing. The trams were so clean and efficient.
Nice.
Yeah. And it took me everywhere I wanted to go. Plus, I got to see the city like a local.
I love that. There's something so special about experiencing a place from a local's perspective.
Totally. And it kind of reminded me of another point Roberta made. She mentioned that sometimes those hop-on, hop-off buses can feel a bit like a barrier.
A barrier.
Yeah, like you're kind of separated from the actual city, stuck in this bubble.
Ah, I see. Like you're just observing, not really immersing yourself.
Exactly. You miss those little interactions, the street life.
Yeah, I get it. It's like the difference between watching a travel show and actually being there.
Right. I remember this trip to Istanbul. I specifically chose the public tram instead of a hop-on, hop-off bus.
Oh, why is that?
I ended up chatting with a local woman, and she told me about all these amazing places to eat and shop.
Wow, what a cool encounter.
Yeah, and it led me to this hidden gem of a restaurant. It's tucked away in a back street, and the food was incredible.
You wouldn't have found that on a typical tourist route.
Probably not. It really showed me the power of stepping outside that tourist bubble.
I totally agree. Sometimes those unplanned moments are the best part of traveling.
For sure. Oh, and speaking of families, Roberta mentioned something about those childfare age breaks on the buses.
Ah, yes, the fine print can be tricky.
She said sometimes it might actually be more cost-effective to just explore other options, especially if your kids are old enough to walk or handle public transportation.
And walking is free. Plus, it's good exercise for everyone.
Absolutely. And it gives you a chance to really take in the surroundings at your own pace.
Yeah, stopping to admire street performers, grabbing some local snacks.
Those are the memories that stick with you. So, I think this whole conversation about hop-on, hop-off buses is really about much more than just the buses themselves.
What do you mean?
Well, it's about how we choose to travel, what experiences we prioritize.
Right. It's about being more conscious and intentional with our choices.
Exactly. It's about finding what truly resonates with us as travelers.
And sometimes that means venturing off the beaten path and discovering those hidden gems that make a trip truly special.
And Roberta's journey, I think, is a great example of that. It's about being open to new experiences, reevaluating our assumptions, and constantly evolving as travelers.
I think that's such a beautiful way to approach travel, constantly learning and growing.
And who knows, maybe we'll even find some of our own signs from afar along the way.
I hope so. It's what makes traveling so exciting, right?
I think what's so inspiring about Roberta is that she's always learning and growing as a traveler.
Yeah, like she's been at it for years and years, but she's not afraid to re-examine her own assumptions.
Exactly. She's not stuck in her ways. She's willing to try new things and adapt to the changing travel landscape.
And that's what we should all strive for as travelers, right? To stay open-minded and curious.
Totally. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Roberta's evolving views on hop-on, hop-off buses, what are your final thoughts for our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to travel.
Right, like what works for one person might not work for another.
Exactly. It's all about finding what resonates with you, what aligns with your travel style and preferences.
And that might mean dishing the hop-on, hop-off bus altogether and opting for a walking tour.
Or maybe it means trying the local tram system, or even just getting a little lost and seeing where the day takes you.
I think Roberta would wholeheartedly agree with that.
Oh, absolutely. She's all about embracing the unexpected and discovering those hidden gems that make travel so special.
So to our listeners out there, as you plan your next adventure, remember Roberta's journey.
Be open to new experiences.
Reevaluate your assumptions.
And don't be afraid to step off the beaten path.
You never know what amazing discoveries await.
Happy travels, everyone. CAC. CI.